this is the first time the Wolfsonian is really kind of taking on a virtual screening of this nature, and so we also appreciate kind of your patience and flexibility as we kind of iron out the kinks to this process. So if there's any feedback you'd love to share with us afterwards, just improve the experience for everyone involved, we definitely welcome that after the fact as well. So appreciate your flexibility on that end. Shoshana, would you like to maybe begin? And then people kind of just join us.
Sure.
Perfect. So, hello everyone. My name is Oscar Rieveling. I'm the education manager at the Wolfsonian FIU, and very happy to welcome everyone online who's tuned into this program. I'm joined by my colleague Shoshana Resnikoff, curator as well here at the museum. And so we're very happy to kind of just take this time, this moment, and kind of perhaps share a few thoughts, a few impressions on The Stranger by Orson Welles. We're not authorities on the subject, but we definitely kind of wanted to just share a little on the film, our impressions again, and perhaps obviously in light of not being able to gather, still have some sort of forum and exchange for our different perspectives. So I don't know, Shoshana, any first impressions upon initial viewing that kind of come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really interesting watching the film is the sort of the like very quick pace at which the plot progresses. I once or twice had to get up to get some water, and I'd come back, and like a lot had happened in that amount of time. And I'm not an expert on Orson Welles, but I have seen some of his films, and they are generally a lot more meandering. I mean, Citizen Kane is something where you sit and you really watch it, and it pulls you in, and it's really as much about the kind of visuals as it is about the plot. And so that was to me a really interesting contrast. I think in doing some reading about the film, this was Welles's sort of biggest commercial hit for whatever measure.
The one box office success, absolutely.
Exactly. And it was really his attempt to show that he could do commercial films that would be popular, but he also was sort of battling a really aggressive editor. What was the term that they called him, Oscar? Welles referred to him as literally his nemesis, this editor.
Exactly.
And I think what you end up seeing on film is really just a small portion of what Welles wanted, and a lot of the sort of like most atmospheric, most sort of Wellesian moments I think probably made it to the cutting room floor. And it's interesting to imagine what the film might have been had he been at the helm of editing. A lot more meandering probably, but also maybe with a little bit more space to breathe. Especially, I mean, that end, like we talked about, just sort of like, he's dead, it's over. There's no come down from that moment.
I mean, just the body.
Yeah.
But in terms of kind of this closing in feeling, I think that's definitely what I guess the final impression is meant to kind of augment. But I think what you mentioned is important. I think when most people think of Orson Welles, The Stranger isn't necessarily kind of the first work or example one might kind of conceive of. And so kind of another kind of important point to bring about is this issue of authorship, or how much Orson Welles felt was an actual reflection of his kind of work and practice. Yeah.
No, please continue. Sorry.
So actually, like many like kind of like Orson diehards like don't think of this as an actual work by him, within this of. However, there still is so much there, and so I hope we can kind of just touch upon a couple extra points there. But we mentioned in terms of like this meandering is also I think important. The initial sequence, so kind of establishing kind of the plot, how we kind of arrive at this small town, isn't from the get-go. There is kind of this slow transition, chase across continents. And I think that was really kind of where he wanted to interject his perspective. There was meant to be a longer extended scene across Latin America, and that was really the part where Orson was looking to kind of shape the screenplay. Again, as you mentioned, though, there was so many limitations and stipulations kind of established by the studio that he just had to kind of accept and bear the brunt of that. I think just hoping to kind of obviously, yeah, again, maybe reestablish his reputation to really deliver on time, on budget. Actually, I believe the film was completed one day before schedule, so he delivered. Orson Welles delivered, but unfortunately, the studio didn't think it would be the success it was. and his contract was meant to kind of enable him greater creative success, or sorry, freedom, with 4 subsequent films, which were then removed, unfortunately. So it's just funny, kind of the conditions that kind of really shape that. But again, also being at the mercy of the editor, for example, is not the typical kind of working relationship that a director might have with his crew.
Yeah, and I think I don't know, I'm struck by that kind of meandering intro where you are really you're not really sure what's going on, you know, you're following this man, and interestingly he's followed by a woman, and apparently the initial plan that Orson Welles had for this film was that the character Wilson, the Nazi hunter, was going to be played by a woman, because he liked the idea of like, what does it look like if this mouse, I think he described her as mousy, which feels like a call that I don't know that he's qualified to make, but whatever. That this, what would it look like if sort of this unassuming woman was following this man and trying to uncover this information about him? Obviously that didn't happen, but it's interesting to think about that sort of, that figure at the beginning, that woman who's following him is perhaps sort of this avatar for that figure. But that, what I find so interesting, sort of thinking about the post-war history, is that sort of global jaunt that he takes you on at the beginning is actually also very true, right? Of the dispersal of war criminals across the world, and especially obviously to Latin America, but to other parts of the world as well. And so there is this, I think, truth embedded in that lost, or at least abbreviated, introduction that I think comes up again and again in this film, which is interesting because, you know, it's not a Holocaust movie, right? Like that's a genre that we're familiar with today. And this is not that. It's noir, but it's noir that takes the Holocaust in as its sort of like underpinning, as its foundation. And so thinking about where there are these sort of, I don't know if they were intentional or accidental, sort of truths woven through the film. And then of course, obviously the use of actual footage from the concentration camps, kind of this little miniature movie within a movie that Wells stitches together when he's making Mary watch that footage. To me, that's this sort of like, just really fascinating subtext to the entire film. You know, what is the difference between a Holocaust film and a movie about the after effects of the Holocaust is an interesting kind of tension. And of course, Holocaust films didn't exist when he was making this. So
that's such an important point. Absolutely. This was the first inclusion of this type of footage in a Hollywood production. So absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know. It's
but as contemporary viewers, obviously our impression is quite different, right? So for us, this is really salient, this is significant. But I think with contemporary viewers, and perhaps along Orson's intentions, this was at a time when people couldn't just really wrap around their minds about these atrocities, about these crimes that were committed. And so this was a very kind of subtle way to inflect that message.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up sort of the viewers of the period, because it was a box office success, as you said. But I was looking up contemporaneous reviews, and there was one in particular. The New York Times, really, the critic did not like this movie. And one thing that really struck me, there were these two quotes that I'm going to pull up, if that's okay. At one point, he writes. At the end, the final line is, "The atom bomb newsreels on the same bill," meaning going to the movies, "are immeasurably more frightening." And I don't want to discount the very legitimate fear that atom bomb newsreels would have brought forward to people, but I think there's just this. At no point in the review does he mention that footage, but he is referencing these sort of contemporary fears around the atom bomb. And so I just think there's this very interesting kind of different understanding of the concentration camps and what was happening in Eastern Europe. And that perhaps this review in some ways sort of captures I don't know if it's the inability to understand, but sort of a lack of understanding of the full dimension in 1946 that people might have been experiencing. He also, in the same critic, writes that he criticizes Orson Welles' performance and saying basically that Welles isn't monstrous enough. He writes, "At least this hopeful observer, he gave no illusion of the sort of depraved and heartless creatures that the Nazi mass murderers were." And that's such a fascinating insight into at least this man's understanding of who Nazis were in 1946, that they were depraved monsters. And you can imagine this sort of image of a ravenous beast almost in the way he writes about it. When in reality, we know that like the true horror is quoting Hannah Arendt is almost too obvious, but the banality of evil, right? The knowledge that what you're doing is morally wrong, but this willingness to kind of this complicity that we now recognize as being sort of core. So I just found that to be like a very interesting and unexpected take, sort of like going into a time machine and seeing people's drastically different views of the same event.
Completely, yeah. The role of this footage as well, material, and kind of driving home what is the perceived truth. And so even in seeing this, there's still kind of a rejection and a pushback in accepting it. I think of perhaps The Clockwork Orange as well, and like the use of showcasing or projecting a sequence, and then the type of response that's meant to be elicited. But really, yeah, it's the search for truth within this. And I really feel for Mary, though, who's caught at this kind of I don't know, at the behest of either Mr. Wilson or Franz, like she's just caught in the middle, but takes it in stride.
And I will say, poor Mary. I mean, Mr. Wilson is very willing to use her as a pawn, and the way he talks about maybe she'll survive, maybe she won't, maybe she'll be driven crazy, maybe she won't. I guess we'll find out. Like, he's just so cavalier about her well-being. I was really struck by that.
And the father just assents to it without a problem, in the name of justice, as a court justice himself.
Yeah. I also, just because I want to make sure that we've got time to get to questions, but I also I can't let this go because I'm a material culture person and a decorative arts person. I was really taken with the sets. There was an article that I read about the way that they built the set. It's actually kind of 4 interconnected areas, so you really can walk from one part of the set in a house to outside and then back inside. And so there's a lot of depth to that, which is really interesting. Oftentimes in mirror shots, you see the person mirrored, and then behind them you actually see the road and then the next building over, which is a really remarkable degree of depth. But I was also struck by how early like the emphasis on kind of early American antiques, Americana, this, like, it is so excessive. It's colonial revival up the wazoo. All of the buildings, everything's a turned leg or a column or a broken pediment. It's like it's so classic Connecticut River Valley early American. And to me, that, I mean, it's a built set, so those are really deliberate decisions being taken, I think, to kind of overemphasize the Americana quality of it, which also makes the clock so striking, because that is not the right kind of clock on top of that kind of church. Like, that is a Congregationalist church, and that clock is incredibly Germanic. Like, it's so medieval and Teutonic. Like, what is it doing on top of that church? Which, of course, is just this perfect moment that he's killed by it. So
that's why I guess they couldn't figure out how to fix it until his arrival.
Exactly, because they somehow had a German clock on top of their Congregationalist church.
Mm-hmm. Sean, as you mentioned, we do want to kind of leave some time for any questions some of our guests here tonight might have. So let's go ahead and take a look at anything that's been submitted so far. So we have someone who's wondering if it'd be interesting as an exercise to consider how Orson would feel about the capture of Eichmann in Argentina.
That's a great question, and I sadly don't know the answer, but I was thinking the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. Just, because it's 1964. Am I making that up? I might be wrong about that date, but it's, it's decades after this is made, but it is such a fascinating question given what this film is about. And I sadly don't know the answer, but I'm gonna do some research and try to find out.
We'll follow
Actually,
up.
yeah.
Perfect. And then we have Albert here, who's asking what we make of the apology presented for not understanding depravity, because one's unconscious won't allow you to accept. This comes out during the conversation between Mary and her father, and Wilson's plan to let defenses unfold on their own.
I mean, I think that's a metaphor, right, for the whole, for all the circumstances that bring about the film, right? Like an inability to accept that something is happening is how bystanders let bad things happen to a certain degree. So I think there's like a very kind of big sort of lesson to be taken from that. But I also think it's very true kind of on an individual level as well. So it to me was a powerful, Mary's overacting aside, it felt like a very powerful sort of metaphor.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Next we have Jean, who's asking how we see the stranger viewed within Orson's larger film canon. I think part of the interest in definitely selecting this specific film was kind of, again, also expanding this notion beyond what we might associate with the filmmaker generally. This was his kind of most wholehearted commercial enterprise he took on in his career, and so it was interesting kind of see a different facet and how this was kind of subject to different conditions established by the studio. There were, I think, 4 screenwriters, and so really the degree of authorship that Orson himself felt reflected in the final output was not really to his standard or degree of what he would kind of stand behind. And so in the end, I think he really kind of pushed against it, identified this film as kind of on the lower end in terms of his output, and so wasn't really kind of keen on engaging with this in the future. Let's see here.
We got a question about 1940s obsession with creepy husbands. Suspicion, Rebecca, Gaslight, this movie, other examples that might exist. What's up with the 1940s obsession with creepy husbands? It would be really interesting, and I'm sure there are true crime historians who can attest to this, when the sort of idea of the husband did it enters sort of the I don't know, communal mind of true crime. So I don't have a better answer than that. It's not an answer. But yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think too, like noir and movies that play with the idea of the danger that's lurking beside you. I mean, a romantic relationship, a husband and wife, ideally a partnership, like that's kind of the most unsettling way to manifest that idea, right, is to do it within a marriage. And perhaps it's because of latent sexism that it's not often women. I don't know, that the risk seems to be coming from the man. But it's an interesting question. Do you have any thoughts, Oscar?
I was also maybe struck by the relationship with the father and just how that dynamic was, and obviously kind of the patron of the family and the patriarch, and kind of just being at the mercy of his whims. I think she addressed him by his first name, I believe. Well, father might have been, but towards the end, like when they're in some sort of embrace.
Yeah.
So I think maybe again, kind of just a prevalent kind of societal convention that we're seeing kind of reflected there. We are unfortunately though at the end of our time, and so want to be mindful of that. Again, we just want to reiterate that we appreciate your flexibility with this program. This is the first time we kind of take on this format, so again, we welcome suggestions in improving future presentations.
Can I make one comment? Jay Silverman did mention something really interesting, which is that in Judgment at Nuremberg, Stanley Kramer also used film excerpt within the film featuring concentration camps, and he raises a good point that perhaps he was in fact influenced by The Stranger. So this movie, as problematic as it is for Wells's own sort of sense of his body of work, you know, he didn't really consider it his, as we established, and it certainly didn't fully realize his vision for the film. It perhaps continued to have influence.
Mm-hmm. So kind of nudging a positive direction in terms of
something of a happy ending for The Stranger.
On that note, thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope to see you soon at our next Wolf Watch.
Yeah, thank you guys.